Hello, everyone, and welcome to Espresso Talk Today. My name is Hans, and thank you for joining us. Today, we are talking about an uncommon conversation about Black-centered psychology. The Espresso Talk Today team is pleased to welcome Dr. Theopia Jackson, the former president of the Association of Black Psychologists. This is the first of a two-part discussion with Dr. Theopia Jackson. So, grab an espresso and get comfortable for this uncommon episode. Let's listen in.
Hey Mel, hey Diane.
Hi,
Hi,
Robin.
Robin. How are you?
I'm doing really well, thank you. And you?
Doing great.
Yeah, feeling good today. Feeling good today.
Great. And wow, and it's a great day because I'm actually here having a meeting with a really special person, as you can see. She is Dr. Theopia Jackson, immediate past president of the Association of Black Psychologists. You might know it as ABPSI. And anyway, Dr. Jackson, let me introduce my esteemed members of the Espresso Talk Today team, Mel Lofton and Diane Bradley.
Nice
So,
to meet you, Dr.
nice to meet
Jackson.
you as well. It's a pleasure.
So you guys are probably wondering why I'm meeting with the psychologist today. And you might be thinking that maybe you should give us some privacy, but no worries, this is not therapy, it's not a therapy session. Dr. Jackson and I are actually meeting to discuss what's known as Black psychology. And, when I first came across this term, I thought, well, of course, there's Black history, there's Black philosophy, I even took a course in Black economics. But I admit, Black psychology had me a little bit stumped. And so I started looking it up, and I came across this article in I think it's a lay magazine, Psychology Today. And let me just briefly tell this article, because this really said a lot to me. It says, when I was a young professor, I remember having a conversation with one of my African-American graduate students, and she basically told her that the white department of psychology chair, who was white, essentially told her there was no such thing as Black psychology. And he said, well, like many white and older psychologists, he had been trained to understand psychology as a colorblind scientific discipline. And so there couldn't possibly be anything called Black psychology. And that very few of the faculty members study ethnicity, race, or cultural issues because this really got to me. These issues were not central in the field of psychology. So that's why I had to meet with Dr. Jackson. I had to ask this question. What is Black psychology? Department chairs are saying it doesn't exist. It's colorblind. It's a science. There's no culture involved. So tell me, what is Black psychology?
Well, thank you, Sister Lofton, first and foremost for the invitation. And I'm excited to be here with you and Sisters Diane Bradley and your dear mother and queen, Mama Lofton. So thank you for the invitation. And let me first centralize who I am for the listeners. I am a student of Black psychology, first and foremost. So I'm trained in as a clinical psychologist here in the United States, meaning that I have come through the American Psychological Association and received all the rights and privileges and ongoing bills, if you will, for being a professional clinical psychologist. My specialty has been with children and families, and particularly in pediatric care. I'm currently the chair for the clinical psychology program at Saybrook University, which is out of Pasadena, California. We are a hybrid program. But to your point, I want to kind of go back to what it means to be a student of Black psychology. First and foremost, the Association of Black Psychologists was founded in 1968 by a small handful of graduate Black students as well as Black scholars. For those who may not be familiar, during the 1968 period, this is when civil rights was a huge issue in the United States.
Right.
And so there was a greater consciousness within the Black communities in general to define who we are, understand who we are, and to recognize the oppression and racial trauma that we were exposed to and push back. So everybody was trying to do that. So understandably so, these Black scholars had were attending the international meeting for the American Psychological Association that was held in San Francisco. They took the floor to ask the question, what does culture have to do with the psychology at the time? And they were very clear to pose that there were differences, that our tools of the trade, if you will, the theories that we use to define, diagnose, and prescribe for people's lives were grounded in certain cultural values, more specifically those of Eurocentric, and not necessarily applicable across all people. At that particular time, the American Psychological Association denounced the conversation. They maintained what the example you just read earlier here is that their findings, the assessment tools that were being used to decide if a child needed special education and all those other tools we had were universal experiences. So this small group of graduate students and professionals walked away from that meeting and instead did what Black folks do, if you will, which is they went, got some fried chicken, a little bit of spirits, and decided to have their own deep conversation about these issues. And from that space was born this organization called the Association of Black Psychologists. And the scholars were keen enough to say, now that we have this, we have to figure out what is Black psychology. So Black psychology then was born from multiple disciplines that were trying to answer the question, what does it mean to be human from an African or Black-centered perspective? And so they came at this as anthropologists, as clinical psychologists, developmental psychologists, social theorists, I mean, all types of coming here. And it actually resulted in what we might say traditionally has been three different schools of thought within Black psychology. That first group would have been what we call our traditionalists or resistors, and their primary objective was to use focused scientific inquiry to be able to plead the case that African Americans move through the world somewhat differently than their white American counterparts. And so folks who we can credit for this are folks like doctors Kenneth Clark and Mamie Fitz Clark, who are well known for the doll story. And for the listeners, if you haven't, I do invite you to do an internet search on the doll study by Clark and Clark. Basically, what this was showing is that among young children of all walks of life, but definitely Black children, if you put in front of them a Black doll, a white doll, and begin to ask them questions, which doll is beautiful? There was a prevalence among all of them, but more painfully among the Black children, to choose the white doll.
Wow.
Which doll is ugly? The reverse would happen. They would choose the Black doll. Which doll is most likely to do something wrong? And so this moved on. So once again, they're using this scientific, measurable outcome, evidence-based study to show that somewhere in the psyche of young children in America, they were getting the message that to be Black was to be wrong, ugly, evil, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The second school of thoughts were those we call the reformists. And for them, their primary focus was to develop new theories of understanding and explaining the behaviors of people of African ancestry here in the United States. And here we have phenomenal leaders like William Cross, who was one of the first to bring forward an ethnic identity formation theory. I want to give a complete shout out for Baba Joseph White, who's actually been conceptualized as the father of Black psychology. And his seminal paper called Towards a Black Psychology came out in the early 70s. And as opposed to posting this in a quote, peer-reviewed journal, meaning all the scholars are talking to each other, he intentionally chose to publish that article in the Essence magazine, which is a long-standing Black magazine in the United States. In other words, it was important to him to turn this conversation over to the people. And then the last group of these schools of thought are our radicalists. And these are phenomenal names and leaders like Naeem Akbar, Wade Nobles, Leonard James Myers, Cody Kamban. For this group, they were more intentional to go beyond the United States waters. For them, they wanted to deeply go back into Africa, go back to the mother country to be a student there and understand what were already the cultural practices and beliefs of people of African ancestry, and then critically ask themselves how that might still be manifested in the African Americans here in the United States, specifically those who are direct descendants of the first trafficked Africans to America. In addition to this, the radicalists are also involved in how to, quote, resurrect or remember and reclaim our own Black humanity, not only in the United States, but globally. So I just want to summarize by saying again that the science of Black psychology has been in existence for more than 50 years, and its intentionality is to situate the cultural practices and beliefs of people of African ancestry around the globe for trying to understand what is humanity and what is best for us from that perspective while we are still interacting with others. And I want to close by saying this too here. As we center ourselves on Blackness, it is not to the exclusion of anyone else. It simply is in centering, because I think that all the listeners would agree that no matter where you are in the world, if you are of African ancestry, somehow the lie of Black inferiority and the lie of white supremacy is operating. It just manifests itself differently based on the context. So these leaders collectively, particularly Baba Joseph White, I would say have contributed to the growing body of what's called multicultural psychology and all the other ethnic groups who have been intentional to define who they are from their own cultural zone in relationship to others. That was a long-winded response, but I want to thank you for the invitation to pose the question, to pose the response with you.
No, wow, that really explained a lot. And I didn't know about these three schools. And I'm thinking, okay, there's this Black psychology, this monolith, but it's
We're
actually.
definitely not monolithic. Definitely not. And we're actually engaging more in what's called Pan-African psychology, where we are in conversation with other Black scholars around the diaspora. So for example, I want to give a shout out here for the Forum of African Psychology, which is our counterpart group that's coming out of South Africa, where this too is a group of scholars who are really wanting to, again, on the soil of Africa, bring the psychology of Africa into the training of practitioners when the current schools that are there are not doing that. They're actually intentionally, unintentionally, not for me to judge. I leave that to the people who are living the experience, where they are eradicating African wisdom in order to become a professional psychologist.
Mm-hmm. And when did this school start? This forum start in from South Africa?
The Forum of African Psychology, I would like to say that they probably began within the last 10 to 20 years. It's still relatively new, if you will. They've been engaging in conversations with us. And I want to give a shout out for our leadership at the time, because initially these scholars were wanting to join ABPSI as a chapter, because we do have chapters all over the world. However, our leaders are very clear to say, no, you should be your own independent group. Like we're family in this work together. Because, and the reason they were saying that is they wanted to make sure that with good intentions that we as, quote, Western Africans did not inadvertently co-opt our own. Right? Right.
Yeah,
So instead, we're wanting to lift them up as they define themselves and set their own course so that we could be that much stronger sitting side by side as the circle grows around the globe of Black wisdom, so the circle remain unbroken.
Absolutely.
yeah. Dr. Jackson, and again, I thoroughly appreciate the work that you've done. I actually majored in psychology as an undergraduate decades ago, I won't say what year, uh, Black psychology was still kind of new to me in that realm. And again, I was very much interested in the Black psychology world because that was my interest to see how we can help treat and, for that matter, be supportive to our community.
Yes. Yes.
So one of the questions I have, and you've talked about pretty extensively, kind of the laying the foundation and how the foundation was laid with regards to how Black psychologists and Black psychology has basically established its roots and, for that matter, the framework with other psychologists. But if you could provide, a little bit more explanation, or for that matter, share with the listeners, why is Black psychology so necessary? And again, given that it's supposed to be, psychology is supposed to be a colorblind scientific discipline that you talked about, why is it so necessary in the Black community?
Well, thank you for the question, my dear Sister Bradley. I'm going to answer this in my own personal development as a psychologist, if you will. I can remember very early on running across a reading called Fictive Kin, and it was written by, I believe, Carol Stack, who was a white social worker at the time. And this again was in the 70s, where we still had, quote, the ghettos is how they would describe inner city life, which of course meant more persons of African ancestry in a more impoverished environments. And we would have the projects, which are these very tall buildings that would house, 70 or more apartments in there for families. Again, I'm trying to be respectful of your listeners and not assume that everyone knows my Western world, right? To give the context. But anyway, so Carol Stack had an opportunity to live with a Black family in the projects for several months, which is what we call a naturalistic approach to research, which she's really wanting to be among and really observe. And so and first I want to commend the family who opened themselves up for such an experience, right? So she was able to denote certain behaviors like the prevalence of the family she stayed with caring for other people's children at any given time. Like they'd sit down to dinner and it could be not only the family or the children who belong there, but the kids from upstairs, downstairs, across the neighborhood, if you will. Also, there was this referencing she had of people acting like family with one another, even though they weren't legally or biologically related. They would call each other cousins and brothers and act that way, yet it wasn't official, if you will. And then the other observation she would make too is the sharing of minimal resources. Like someone would share their last $5. Now, understandably so, those types of behaviors and similar ones have been noted in a number of different Black communities. When Carol Stack went to give interpretation, meaning why was this happening, what she came up with was this was Black America's response to racism and poverty. That's a viable hypothesis. However, I'm also thinking of Black scholars who came behind her, who could recognize the same behaviors, but it had a whole different theoretical interpretation and grounding for it. What they would say is, this is part of our DNA. This is what Black folks do. If you leave us in the room together long enough, we're gonna start acting like family. My children grew up in a very affluent area, and yet they would still meet that same criteria. They got folks they grew up with and they call auntie and uncle, that there's no biological legal relationship. As a matter of fact, my daughter was quite upset with me when she was an adult, when she realized that her auntie was just my line sister in my sorority. Okay. Girlfriend was not happy about that.
No blood relation there, huh?
Exactly. So what we're seeing is that these same behaviors manifest themselves regardless of one's social economic status, regardless of how their families are defined. It's just who we is. As a matter of fact, if you're lucky enough, you become family with us no matter what you look like, because it's
That's
less
right.
about that and more about how you feel in the room. So this is just one clear example that our theories were limited. So Carol Stack's hypotheses and interpretations were right on from her limited worldview as a white American. Because that's the meaning making. It's more individualistic. As I say this for the listeners, please do not hear this as a comparison in terms of which is better than the other. Instead, I want to remind you, what we're doing is centering again, because there's crucial information being missed if the scholar is not able to recognize that these behaviors are coming out of cultural ways of being. And looking at the facial responses of my dear colleagues on this call, you are affirming for me, which I've also experienced too, that these behaviors show up all around the Blackness of world.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
So those are
Yeah.
examples of why it's important. And the other reason why it's important too is that many times our behaviors are, quote, pathologized. And it's because they're being misinterpreted, and they end up leading to misdiagnoses where we're being given a pathological diagnosis, and or things like in the educational system where our children are more likely to be placed in special education because the tools that are being used to assess their, quote, intelligence are not from their worldview. So they're already at a disadvantage. So it is very dangerous to not pay attention to someone's cultural practices and beliefs when you're trying to understand what's going on in their life.
Okay. Yeah. And I agree with you, and that it definitely makes a difference. And actually, that kind of centers around a question I had in terms of with regards to Eurocentric and Afrocentric approaches to, can they be worked together in terms, or for that matter, is there some kind of combining of the theories so that it does tailor to, and for that matter, the approach can be kind of used together to help with regards to, helping our community in determining diagnosis and things of that nature?
Let me say yes and no and clarify that. I want to remind us first of the three different schools in Black psychology. And as I bring forth these ideas of schools, I also want to underscore that they are not in competition with one another. That too is uniquely different. When the way I was trained in American Psychological Association psychology, they would describe their theoretical histories as being in different forces, right? The first force, the second force, the third force, language already. Each of these forces are almost jockeying, if you will, and competing among each other to be the one. Within Black psychology, these three schools, and it's probably more developing now, can coexist together. And so the answer to your question is informed by who the theoretical practitioner is and what they're being informed by, if you will, as well as who the client is. Because I would say about who they are as an African being in this world. So therefore, a more traditionalist approach would not suffice them. They would need to be worked with by a practitioner who's grounded in the more of a radicalist approach, which means that they're solely working from Afrocentric practices and beliefs. But then there may be others who are living, the client may be more of may resonate in other spaces of Blackness where there could be some integration of traditional Eurocentric ways of being and practicing with those of African centered. So that's why I say to you, it's not a yes, no question. It's more about centralizing it on on the theory of that particular practitioner, as well as what's needed by that particular client.
Okay. Yeah, and that helps explain why definitely, as you had mentioned, that this is important and that it supplements, if you will, the different practices of psychology and the importance of combining, and for that matter, using it in appropriate ways. One other thing.
Apologies for interrupting, but just one clarifier for me, because I believe we are going in the same direction, but I wanted to respectfully say supplement may not be the most appropriate word. I'll give this as a metaphor.
Okay.
Many people are aware of, quote, feminist thinking.
Right.
There has been a universal movement, because it's still happening, in understanding that people who identify as female in their genderness, in their essence, have a different way of thinking about things in the world. And so everyone is clear that if you're working with women, you also want to critique feminist thought to see if it's relevant. this is what I'm hypothesizing when you're talking about Black psychology, is that if you're working with a person of African ancestry, then it is incumbent upon you to critique Black psychology to see its application for this particular client. And just like a female person, a female who's not aware of feminist thinking, the practitioner would invite the person to examine feminist thinking to see if it is relevant in their space. The same is true here, that you invite someone of African ancestry to understand Black psychology, all three schools, to see if it's relevant for them. So I just want to, so it wouldn't be supplemental. It's a standalone, equal, and an ethical response, and it should be it's a moral responsibility. It should be an ethical one. And what I mean by that is, if you're trained in Western psychology, there's no ethical obligation that you must introduce a client to their own cultural ways of being in their therapy.
I see.
But it's a moral one.
And thank you for that clarification. And I'll definitely, it gives me a broader perspective and understanding of how the approach is in terms of Black psychology. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the other things that you had mentioned earlier, you had talked about how Black people, and particularly Black young children, are usually pathologized, and that, you know, in essence, it could be very harmful. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how deficit orientation in the ideal, how it applies to Blacks, basically is handled, and for that matter, managed with regards to Black psychology?
Again, a great question, Sister Bradley. You are on it today. So,
help of my colleague here, Robin.
Every day.
Right.
So let me also honor my mentors and teachers by saying, first and foremost, that having this degree as a psychologist is not what, quote, privileges me to have information or to be an expert, because what we know to be true is much of our cultural wisdom and Black excellence comes from mamas, papas, all kinds of folks in the world who do not have a, quote, degree behind their names, but their information is just as wise. And they do not have to be a psychologist. In this moment, even though our dear brother, Reverend Martin Luther King, did in fact have such degrees, he was not a psychologist, but I would submit to you, he was doing the work of psychology in terms of trying to address the psychological, emotional, and well-being of people of African ancestry. And he said very clearly something to the effect of, it's as if somebody one day woke up and said everything Black was bad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we have followed suit. So in psychology, in the early 70s, which is again around the civil rights movement, there was a whole space in our work called the deficit model. And what that basically meant is that most research studies, if not all, were comparing Black children, Black adults, Black anything, to their white counterparts. And whenever there was a difference, it was interpreted as if there was something wrong with the Black folk. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we call that deficit model because that began to message into the school districts that there's something wrong with Black children who can't sit still, right? You know, versus their white counterpart who does sit still, right? It began to message within the court systems and every other aspect of society that there's something wrong with Black folks. And so those messages, or memes, if you will, are still persistent today. If I were to ask the general person in America, what's the typical face of someone who's on welfare, which is our public assistance here, they would very quickly say to you, 9 times out of 10, they'll say to you, it's a Black single woman with multiple children. However, the statistics do not bear that out. Yeah. The reality is that all folks of different ethnic groups are accessing those services, and truth be told, it's predominantly white women. But that's not the story that folks are comfortable with, so this theme comes up of it being this. So the ways in which it becomes very detrimental for our children is this prevalence of the thing called ADHD. Okay, listen carefully. I am not saying ADHD does, quote, not exist. That's a whole nother conversation about whether or not these diagnostic things fit for everybody around the world. But let's just, for the sake of the conversation, let's say it does exist. Why is there such a prevalence for Black boys to be diagnosed with ADHD and placed on medication when we also know that there are multiple etiologies for why a child may show up in the classroom, difficult to sit still, having a hard time to focus? It could be because they've been exposed to trauma. First and foremost, just thinking about the environments from which they come from, right? That they may have already been exposed to toxins or other things that are going on just because of a particular setting. Our communities are more, our inner cities are more likely to have pollutant there because all of those trucks and their toxins are driving through our communities, because in the affluent communities I live in, we've used our legal rights to make sure we detour them out of us, which means they're going through there, right? You're more likely in some inner cities, you're more likely to find more liquor stores than grocery stores and banks, right? And when people are dealing with recovery, there's less access to services, but there's a prolific access to alcohol, right? So what I'm trying to say is there could be other reasons for why our children are showing up with the behaviors that meet the criteria of ADHD, and yet that's not being paid attention to. And here, let me say, I ask that we, for those who are familiar with the common language of at-risk youth, that we critically think about that and let that go. Our children are at potential in at-risk environments. Because if we keep saying at-risk youth and based on the Western way we're trained, which is problem focused, you'll always look to treat and change the child. If you say at-risk environments, and somebody will say, what's happening to these babies? What's going on in their world? What can we do to help stabilize their environments so they can be more better?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a study I remember when I was in school where they had labeled, or for that matter, named a German Shepherd killer.
Ooh.
And then as determined what the dog's behavior was. And he was very aggressive and very hostile, and he wasn't very friendly to others. But once they also changed the name of the dog to something much more palatable, like, Lassie, or for that matter, Ben, or something of that nature, the dog became much more docile, and people interacted with the dog in a much more compliant and, for that matter, friendly manner. So, as you mentioned, names matter, and for that matter, how people are labeled matters. And so that really underscores what you had just said here in terms of labeling our children, particularly our Black boys,
as well as the messaging to the educators, right?
Exactly.
Right?
How
because
they interact.
Because you can have two children presenting with the exact same behaviors, but because we've messaged to you so much that Black children tend to be the problem, then the Black child will be disciplined significantly, and in their white counterpart less likely for the same offense. We have way too many stats of that. I'm reminded of two clinical situations that came up for me in working in California. A family came to me with a 6-year-old boy who was being expelled, a 6-year-old Black boy who was being expelled from school because he touched the breast of the female classmate. Hear me clearly, family. 6-year-old child touched the, quote, breast of another 6-year-old child. And he was in a predominantly white school. So the parents were complaining that this was a sexual assault.
Wow.
Yeah, that's incredible.
And they're saying you can't come back to class until you've seen a psychologist. And when I think about the story of ADHD, I'm going to give another quick synopsis that was very powerful for me. In 2018, I was fortunate enough to accompany a group of students from Saybrook University and our affiliates on a trip to South Africa, where we were not only there to learn more about the culture, if you will, but we're actually interfacing with several different schools to provide services. In one school that I remember visiting in the, quote, poor area, poor community of South Africa, the youth were beautiful. They were phenomenal. They probably range in ages from 8 to about 14. I was just so impressed with how fully they showed up in this day of activities with us. Not only were they able to perform, but more importantly, they engaged in small group conversations and work with myself and our graduate students. And they were absolutely beautiful. If I remember asking one of the teachers, so how do you deal with, recognize, and address the issue of ADHD? And they're like, we don't have it, right? But then you look at our communities in the United States, and they're hard pressed to find a class that has Black children in there where someone hasn't diagnosed them with ADHD. So
Absolutely.
let me be clear. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but if you keep looking for if you keep using a hammer,
Right.
to nail the square into the hole, everything will look like that, right? So
Right.
if that's what's on your brain, every time you see it. So this school had engaged the children in cultural learning in a way that made sense for them and allowed them to fully be present, be age appropriately, actively engaged in their own learning, own their own learnership, and you are less likely to see, quote, disruptive behaviors that suggest ADHD.
Alafia Espresso Talk Today community. It's Alma Robin here. I hope that you are enjoying this uncommon conversation with Dr. Theopia Jackson. I don't mean to interrupt the flow, but we are going to stop here for today. Dr. Jackson has already given us so much important information about Black centered psychology. She presented three schools of thought of Black psychology: the resistors, the reformers, and the radicalists. Maybe you've thought about which one that you're more aligned with. I love how she summarized them by saying Black psychology has been in existence for more than 50 years, and its intentionality is to situate the cultural practices and beliefs of the people of Africans' ancestry around the globe in trying to understand what is humanity and what is best for us from that perspective while we're interacting with others. Wow, do you believe that it's been around for 50 years and is asking, what is humanity? Very interesting. But I have to emphasize Black psychology is not just a theoretical pursuit. It has definite practical application for Black people in terms of dealing with trauma, how we interact as individuals, as families, and as communities, and how we can live our best lives. I really appreciated how Dr. Jackson rejected searching for pathology or problems and how a person is reacting, but rather looking to understand why a person is responding in a certain situation. The term she used about children being at potential in an at risk environment was a brilliant example. So, not a child being at risk, but that child being at potential in an at risk environment. This focuses on fixing the environment of the child, the environment that the child is in, rather than fixing the child who is actually responding appropriately to the difficulty in the environment. Finally, I also want to mention that Black psychology is really not a rejection of Western approaches to psychology, but rather it's an expansion of the scope of psychology to include culture, not just white Western, but actually the person's relevant culture as an important factor in assessing behavior. Dr. Jackson concluded by saying that what we're really talking about is multicultural psychology. Look, I got to say a wow to that one. I better stop here, though, because there is so much more to say. Dr. Jackson will return next week to conclude this very uncommon and really enlightening conversation. She'll begin with her discussion of racial trauma. That's not an issue typically approached in Western psychology. And its manifestations and effects on Black people, families, and communities. And of course, slavery will be a part of this discussion. This information on racial trauma is so important, yet rarely discussed. Dr. Jackson will also discuss coping strategies for dealing with racial trauma. I really hope that you'll join us for that discussion. Thanks so much to Dr. Theopia Jackson for her incredible work and her generosity in sharing this important life enhancing and possibly even life saving information with us and with you. And if you have any questions or you want to share your thoughts with us, please, you can always contact us at team@espressotalktoday.com. We'd love to hear from you. So take some time to process what you've just heard. It's a lot and it's deep. And come back next time. We look forward to seeing you here. See you next week. Ashe.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Espresso Talk Today. We begin by thanking Dr. Theopia Jackson for generously sharing her time and insights about Black-centered psychology, or Black psychology. As you can see, Black psychology is a complex and Black culture-based form of psychology. It is not simply having a Black therapist. Dr. Jackson said, Black psychology was born from multiple disciplines that were trying to answer the question, what does it mean to be human from an African or Black-centered perspective? She approached the response to this question with Robin, Mel, and Diane from 3 different schools of thought. One important lesson from this discussion is that psychology, especially Western psychology, is not a colorblind discipline. Western culture is embedded in many of the psychological theories, approaches, treatments, or even the DSM, all to the detriment of Black people. This causes Black behavior to be pathologized, misdiagnosed, and mistreated rather than viewed as a natural response to trauma or environmental differences. Dr. Jackson emphasized that it is very dangerous to not pay attention to someone's cultural practices and beliefs when you're trying to understand what's going on in their life. Black psychology attempts to correct this problem. Many issues were discussed in part 1 of this episode, but there is so much more that Dr. Jackson addressed. In part 2, Dr. Jackson will give us more insights about different therapies and the persistent problems of misdiagnosing and treating mental health problems in Black patients. She will focus on Black or African-centered approaches to promoting good mental health, and, as a special bonus, Dr. Jackson will guide us through a relaxing and spiritual Black-centered meditation. You do not want to miss this amazing experience. And if you want more information about Black psychology, please visit the Espresso Talk Today website at espressotalktoday.com, where you'll find helpful resources. If you enjoyed this podcast show, please tell your friends about Espresso Talk Today. They just might enjoy this podcast too. We're all in this together. We look forward to seeing you next week for more uncommon conversation. Ciao!